Good evening and welcome to the Historical Society Long Beach's 2019 Public Oral History event. Most of you know me probably, but I'm Evan Anderson Browdy, both a past president and a longtime board member of the Historical Society of Long Beach. Tonight we feature President of the UC Regents and former California State Speaker of the Assembly, John A. Perez, interviewing this woman I've known for more than 30 years. And currently the Long Beach Harbor Commission President, Bonnie Lowenthal. Fact you won't hear. A fact you won't hear from Bonnie is that when I was elected to the city council, actually before I was elected, I met her briefly, but during the campaign for city council, she supported my opponent. A lesson to be learned, I never did that when, in all the years she was being elected. And anyway, Bonnie and I believe the Historical Society of Long Beach is an important part of this community. We both support the organization fully and with our efforts, like this evening, and as well as financially. We hope that you, like us, understand that the city's past is the key to shaping the future. We also would encourage you to join us becoming members today if you aren't already a member. And if you have the ability, join the Historical Society's Crest Circle, which you can learn more about by picking up a brochure. I saw them at the front desk, and there may be some around the tables. Thank you again for coming and supporting the Historical Society. And now let me introduce our Executive Director, Julie Bartolotto, who will give us a little more information before the main event.
Thank you, Evan. Without you, this wouldn't happen. And thank all of you for being here this evening and for purchasing tickets. I'd like to thank Keesal, Young, and Logan and Richard Brown for this warm reception and hosting us this evening. I'd also like to recognize and thank the Port of Long Beach for being our sponsors. And we have a few distinguished guests here this evening. We have Mayor Beverly O'Neill. We have former Councilwoman Renee Simon. And if I've missed anyone, please let me know. Of course, we have Evan Anderson Browdy. Councilwoman and former Harbor Commissioner Doris Topsy-Elvord. I'd also like to recognize Melanie Wirtz, the president of the Historical Society. And I'd like, if you're a board member with the Historical Society, to please raise your hand and be acknowledged. Thank you all. I'd like to thank a few people who helped put this event together. First, Dr. Kay Briegel, a historian who is the backbone of what the Historical Society does. And Kay, will you raise your hand? Thank you. And it wouldn't have happened without Evan Anderson Browdy and Nikki Tennant here in the front row. The Historical Society of Long Beach has a museum and an archive in Bixby Knolls. We work to preserve the history of the city and to create an inclusive community narrative through our collections, exhibitions, and programs like this one. We can do this only in partnership with our members and donors, and I'm grateful for you all. Tonight, we will highlight the work of a committed and determined community member. We hope her story will inspire you and raise awareness about how much the city has changed in the past 40 to 50 years. Tonight's event raises important funds to preserve the Historical Society of Long Beach's historical collections. Some collections are donated by individuals, some by organizations, and some by the City of Long Beach. And our collections include both the personal papers and the city's papers of Mayor O'Neill, Council Member Tonya Reyes-Uranga, and Harbor Commissioner Bonnie Lowenthal. These collections require organizing, cataloging, and rehousing. All of that must be done before the collections are useful for the public. Your membership and proceeds from tonight support this work. Thank you for supporting our effort to preserve the materials and the stories that shape Long Beach. I encourage you to deepen your support by becoming a member if you aren't one already. This event follows in the footsteps of our 2009 Mayor's Oral History Series. And in 2009, in our gallery, we interviewed every living mayor of Long Beach. We interviewed Mayor O'Neill, Mayor Eunice Sato, Mayor Tom Clark, Mayor Bob Foster, and Mayor Ernie Kell. Fortunately, these interviews, and we paired these elected officials with other elected officials, are preserved for researchers and future generations. And tonight's program is being recorded and will also be archived and available on our website. Our special guest interviewer tonight is Speaker Emeritus of California's 68th Assembly, John A. Perez. He is a lifetime leader in the labor movement, serving as the political director for the California Labor Federation and the United Food and Commercial Workers. He was elected to the Assembly in 2008, and he served in the Assembly until 2014. And in 2010, his peers elected him Speaker of the Assembly. During his tenure, Speaker Emeritus Perez authored the Middle Class Scholarship and created Covered California, the California State Medical Exchange Program. Speaker Emeritus Perez is currently the chair of the University of California Board of Regents and is the principal and founder of Double Nickel Advisors. Having served in the California Assembly with Commissioner Lowenthal, Speaker Perez is uniquely positioned to interview our extraordinary guest this evening. Bonnie Lowenthal's arrival in Long Beach coincides with a time when the city was changing. The city's demographics were shifting. The population was becoming more ethnically and racially diverse and less affluent. Meanwhile, Bonnie worked as a psychologist and as a volunteer in many capacities and as an elected official. In the 1980s, she began working on homelessness issues, and her work in that area has continued. In the 1980s, she also worked for the United Cambodian Community. And in the 1990s, she served on the Long Beach Unified School District Board. She served as a Long Beach City Council member for the 1st District for 8 years, and she served in the State Assembly for 6 years. And today, she is the president of the Long Beach Board of Harbor Commissioners. Bonnie Lowenthal has been involved in many meaningful community and policy projects and in a great deal of work in the community for decades. We have so much to learn from her, and I am honored that she's sharing her story with all of us here tonight. Please welcome Speaker Emeritus John A. Perez in facilitating this discussion with the Honorable Harbor Commission President Bonnie Lowenthal.
Thanks. I don't want to do this as a traditional interview. I really want us to just have a conversation as we normally would. And what I was struck by in the introduction was this idea that your arrival in Long Beach coincided with change. I don't believe that's true. I think your arrival in Long Beach caused a lot of change. And I think people in the crowd that know you know that to be the case. There's been a lot of discussion about your role on the school board, on the city council, in the legislature, now on the commission, but your work really took on a lot of forms before that.
That's
your work
right.
as a family counselor, your work in Labachi and really creating the change in the electoral system in Long Beach.
Right,
But it all started before you got to Long Beach. So you've been
Yes.
here, what, 50 years, roughly?
roughly, yes,
But it started in New York.
yes.
So talk to me about New York. Talk to me about what it was like to grow up in New York with your family And because I think it's instructive for who you are and the change that you've caused in the world. So,
Thank you, John. Well, you're right, because that my beginning was obviously in New York, on Long Island, the daughter of immigrants, the fifth child of an immigrant family. First of all, I just want to thank my kids for being here. Danny Lowenthal, Josh Lowenthal, thank you so much for coming. I love you. When I grew up in New York, I was very fortunate. My dad had a wonderful business, which he started on his own, coming from Russia, having a sixth grade education, going out, selling newspapers, and trying to figure out what he could do to earn an income to support his mother, my grandma, who was a widow. Grandma came from Odessa with 7 children. Grandpa had died in Russia. And so I was very fortunate that my dad had a wonderful business. I grew up in Great Neck, a very affluent suburb of New York City. It was portrayed in The Great Gatsby as the West Egg, you might remember, for those readers among us. And my mom, by that time, had retired. Now, my mom, also an immigrant from another part of Russia, very poor, came when she was 7 because Grandpa, as I think I shared with you earlier, Grandpa was left for dead under a pile of people during a pogrom in Russia. And at that time, my grandfather said to my grandmother, let's get the heck out of here. And so, like all other immigrants, or today they're called refugees, in those days they were immigrants. They came one by one, earned enough money in a factory or a store to send for the next one and the next one, the next one. So my mom didn't arrive until she was 7, and they lived Lower East Side. You've all seen the pictures of those crowded streets, and lived in the back of a store that Grandma and Grandpa ran, which I think was a grocery store. And they made their way. And my mom, who really was the greatest role model of my life, was able to, both parents, let me say this, neither of them knew English. But in the days of those immigrant waves, English language was taught very seriously in the schools. In fact, they had elocution lessons. So if you actually met my parents, you would never know that they were from another country. And they felt that was very important for their development, for their ability to integrate into the society that was there.
what did that mean for kind of the expression of Jewish identity and culture at that time and in that place?
So my mom, I think, was the youngest of the 7, and that was the time of the melting pot. So the idea in those days was to not show where you were from, who you were, where you were from. And I was a product of the melting pot, where my parents didn't feel that Judaism or Jewishness was something to wear on your sleeve, but something to know, but we had to fit in. Maybe I could say it that way. And so they worked very hard to fit in. Not that I knew that when I was growing up, but as I look back, I see that what they wanted to be was much more like British, more Europeans, Chippendale furniture and so on and so forth. That was very important to them. They felt that was success, and that's what they wanted for their children. Actually, what they wanted more than anything was an education, because they couldn't get it themselves.
But despite, I mean, your father had a sixth grade education.
Yes.
Your mother had access to a high school education, but really geared towards more vocational training as opposed to academic
Yeah, well,
training.
today we'd call it voc ed. She was not, as an immigrant, she wasn't allowed to go to on the academic side of high school. And so she went to Washington Irving High School for a vocational degree, and she learned bookkeeping.
But she leveraged it for something very different.
Oh, she leveraged it big time, and over time, she became a buyer for Lord & Taylor, for Bloomingdale's. She was highly respected in the field. She was a great business person.
So it's interesting to look at, kind of the cultural shifts that you're talking about. I'm a movie buff. You're the president of the Harbor Commission. I'm looking out here and remembering the movie On the Waterfront. And Marlon Brando.
Right.
Who gave Brando his start?
Okay. Yeah. I know. He knows the answer. So, interestingly, my family had a couple of branches. When my father came to New York, his great uncle, my grandma's brother, was already here. And my great uncle, Jacob, left Odessa because he was an actor, but he wasn't allowed to perform in his language, which was Yiddish. And that was the language of so many Eastern European Jews. So he came to the New World in order to be who he is, which was a great actor in Yiddish language. And there are lots of tales about my great uncle. He was married 4 times. Nobody knows how many kids he had. Stories about somebody coming to backstage and saying, I'm one of the kids, give him $1, tell him to go away, sort of that kind of thing. But among those 4 marriages, his progeny included some very famous people, including my cousin Stella Adler. So it was Stella Adler, some of you know, as a world-renowned acting coach, who was one of the many children, and she discovered Marlon Brando. So that was a long story. I hope that's okay. She discovered Marlon Brando, and he was one of her lovers, and blah blah blah. All that kind of stuff. Yeah, but I'll tell you. I think I shared with you earlier. This melting pot business, it had strengths and weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses was not allowing the children, to recognize the value of an Eastern European heritage. And so one of my father's sisters, Francine Larimore, became very, very famous. She was the first Roxy Hart in Chicago. She had gone to Hunter High School in New York. So this is after coming as an immigrant, and studied and was obviously very quick and very talented. But my parents called the work that she did the legitimate theater, as opposed to the Yiddish theater. Yeah. So there was that part of my family's heritage that was denied, that wasn't valued to the same degree as the other.
And I think you see echoes of that today in society, with the question of how we deal with successive generations of immigrants and what we value and what we don't. I wonder, in your work here, you've got a tremendous history of working with a variety of different groups, right? So you've done probably more work than most people would ever know about with the Cambodian community. you've done more work with the Latino community than folks would often think of. You did more in terms of voting rights and getting district elections established, both at the school board and at the city council. What do you think, maybe let me ask it a different way. Do you think the experience looking back at your family's experiences, refugees or immigrants, inform the way that you look at other successive generations of new Americans and how you look at folding them into our broader society?
You know, my mom, at some point when I was young, my parents must have told me about what was happening in Europe. 6 million. I can't remember a time when they told me, but it was probably unfolded slowly so that I wouldn't be too disturbed by the Holocaust. But I do know that my mom was part of an organization that went down to the docks in New York City to welcome the refugees from Europe. And that was obviously profound. Had a, you know, that's a lasting memory. And as I shared, you know, she was a role model, and I really felt like that was a model to emulate, that I needed to do that as well. And early on in Long Beach, when my former husband, a good friend, Alan, when we became aware that there was a growing Latino community, we became involved. And the idea being that, you know, we were strangers in the land of Israel, as we say every Passover. And we couldn't let anyone else be strangers. So in the early 70s, you know, it was a great time, if you don't mind if I sort of digress. It was just a great time to be in Long Beach because there was so much change. And at the Cal State Long Beach, there was, you know, Black power, there was brown power, there were people asserting their rights for recognition of who they were. And so I was very supportive of people who were claiming their right to be who they are. I mean, that's probably, if I had to say, is there a theme in my life, that certainly would be it. And so I worked for the Centro de la Raza as the mental health consultant for Head Start, and later on for LULAC, Head Start, and then you mentioned the Cambodian community. That was a kind of circuitous route because Evan and I had bought a beautiful piece of Cambodian silk, and I went to the office to claim it, and my predecessor said, "Do you know anybody who wants a job working for this refugee community for UCC?" And I said, "Tell me about it." Well, how could I say no? I mean, these were people who had the population had been decimated. They'd been living in refugee camps. It was just a parallel to what my family experienced. So I just couldn't say no. And fortunately, I didn't, because it's been such a full and rich part of my life to be a part of the Cambodian community and to you know, in every way make sure that Cambodians who have become an integral part of the fabric of Long Beach. And so I don't even remember your question.
It's okay. It was the answer that mattered, not the question. But before you got to Long Beach, you were in Wisconsin. You studied in Wisconsin.
I did.
How'd you choose Wisconsin? What'd you study at Wisconsin?
Well, I always wanted to travel from the time I was really young.
Wisconsin?
I know. Well, remember, I was in New York, so how do I legitimately travel, right? One of my sisters had gone to Wisconsin, so my parents couldn't say no to Wisconsin. It was kind of the furthest I could go legitimately, that, you know, plus the fact, it was a state school and it was affordable. Mm-hmm. My dad had lost his business, and it was a very trying time for my family. I don't think I was fully aware of it, or, I was a typical teenager who didn't care what life was like for my parents. But that's where I ended up, and I didn't have great grades. It was also a time that at a state school, religion was not an issue, because my older brother was turned down from Amherst because the Jewish quota was already met. So those were the times. Wisconsin and some of the bigger universities were not asking about the quota.
So Wisconsin was the legitimate way to start travel, but after college, you traveled the world. How old
So
were you when
after college, well, I'd earned some money to take a trip to Europe on, a charter flight to Europe. So I was there, I think, for 3 months, and charter flight on a non-jet took about 20 hours to get there. Yeah. And I came back and I found a job at CBS TV. That was a lot of fun, the studios and all that, as a secretary. Because, can I go back and tell you
Please.
about college? So, for whatever reason, when I was in college, I was really interested in working in the prison system. I have no idea why, but I was. So I went to the head of the sociology department. I said, I want to be in corrections. And he said, no. You're a girl, not woman. You're a girl, too short, too pretty, you're petite, you can't be in corrections. And I had no idea how to counter that because I hadn't had my assertion training yet. So I hope you women out there have had your assertion training. Because, had anybody said that to me, now it would obviously be different.
Yeah, but
But, so anyway, the bottom line, so I was a sociology major, which I loved.
But 50 years later, you were in the legislature and you did groundbreaking work around criminal justice reform and treatment of prisoners. Talk about that.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that was, I think, compensating for the fact that I couldn't do it as an undergraduate. What I was gonna, and I'll tell you about that, but what I was gonna say before was I wasn't trained for anything when I got out of college. I had no career path. I had no idea what a career path was. I had no idea. And interestingly, here was my mother, who was a great businesswoman, but neither of my parents ever said what was expected of me, to be this or that or whatever. So I had no idea what I was going to be. But fast forward to the legislature, I did work on bills that I hope are helpful to people. The prison system there were just so many issues, but one of them was how people with severe mental illness were treated. And it took probably 40 days minimum for someone with severe mental illness to get medication involuntarily. There was good reason. The good reason was that the group of, what were they called? The disability rights group lobbied to protect people with mental illness. But it went so far on one side that they weren't getting help immediately. So I had long meetings with everybody who had any kind of interest because, as you know, what does it take to get a bill passed? You need every single interest group at the table to reach consensus, to develop something legislatively to go forward. So we were able to find a path to cut in half the time that it took to give medication to people with severe mental illness and protect them at the same time. That led to other bills for people with mental health challenges. We did the very same thing for people in the local county jail system. I did a bill that allowed people who were found unable, Danny, what's the word? Unable to
Act in their, or make decisions.
be
on
in
their
a trial, incompetent to stand trial. They'd go to for an assessment in a mental hospital. When they were treated and found to be competent to stand trial, unfortunately, what was happening is they'd go to county jail and their medication wouldn't follow them. So at any rate, I did some bills that really helped people who were in that situation.
And that was Danny, your son, the what?
My son, the judge, he loves to. I'm such a Jewish mother.
When Danny,
he loves to teach me.
when Danny got on the bench, we were sitting in the member lounge one day, and she's telling a story about Danny, and she says, Danny, my son, the judge. And the punctuation of the sentence was so perfect that I'd always remind her about her son, the judge. Sorry, Josh. But it was a better setup than her son, the businessman.
Yeah. Right.
But there were there's a thematic around mental health. And I remember one of the other bills you did that was really meaningful is you authored the legislation to stop California's prioritizing finding a cure for homosexuality.
Yeah. That was so easy for me. For those of you who don't know how bills are developed, very often there are two ways that they're developed. It comes from your heart and something you want to do, or it comes from a lobbyist, an interest group who come to you and ask if you're interested in something. So in this case, the group Equality California, very important group, came to me and said, we want you to remove the language in the statute that says we have to find, this said it in California statute, we have to find the cause and cure of homosexuality. I mean, can you imagine? That's what it said. I said, you're kidding me. I couldn't believe it. They said, do you want to do this on our behalf? I said, you betcha I want to do it. And so it was very important. It was very significant for so many of us, personally, for so many reasons. And I was happy to do it. It got a lot of attention, and we did it. I remember in the assembly, it passed 79-1. I think in the Senate it was unanimous, and then the governor signed it.
But even the 79-1, that's really remarkable. I mean, you were always known for finding bipartisan partnerships. But even on that issue, that was tough to get that kind of a vote. And I think it was really only because of your force of personality that you were able to put that together.
Thank
But
you.
so when you came to Long Beach, what brought you to Long Beach? So we know how you got to Wisconsin. We know you traveled. How'd you choose Long Beach?
I didn't really choose it. Alan and I were living in Santa Monica.
Mm-hmm.
He had a postdoctoral fellowship, and he had decided that what he wanted to do more than anything was to teach without the pressure of, publish or perish. And so because he had had a one night a week teaching job to supplement our enormous income of something like $5,000 a year on a postdoctoral fellowship, he became familiar with Long Beach. And so there were lots of other offers, but it really gave him an environment that he was really excited about.
And how soon after that did you decide to enter the master's program?
So when I first got to Long Beach, I'll tell you, the first place I lived in Long Beach, I hope I'm not making fun of anyone, but I remember we lived in a house, and it was a tract house, and I never fully unpacked because I just didn't like tract houses. And so that was 6970, and Josh was born in 1970, Danny was born in 67, and I was working as a computer programmer, an early computer programmer. I was actually on a grant from Cal State Long Beach, probably through the Defense Department, writing Fortran regarding civil unrest around the country. And there were these, you'd write these long programs, and then I drove up to SDC in Santa Monica to put the cards into the computer and wait however long to get it back, so on and so forth. So it was an interesting time. So I did that, and I was also volunteering at the Jewish Community Center with seniors, and I felt like I loved working with seniors, but I needed skills. I needed some skills that I didn't have. And we heard about a master's program in community clinical psychology that was just starting out. And they actually wanted people who had a few years out of school. But it was really intriguing because you could learn clinical skills, but at the same time, the community psychology part was about issues like social change, social justice, the things that I cared about in my heart, and how to address community problems as a whole, as opposed to identifying individuals for treatment. So I decided to apply to the program, and I got into the program.
What was your thesis?
Well, my thesis was about, I did a lot of work in public schools because I felt that mental health and public schools go hand in hand. My kids were in elementary school. I wanted to be involved with the kids, still go on and do my graduate work. So it was developing, so esoteric, a token economy for parents in a public school setting. But really what it was about was, how do you reinforce volunteers, parent volunteers, to get more involved in the schools? And that started me off, I had no idea, on many opportunities for teaching teachers how to work with parents, teaching at Cal State Long Beach, teaching teachers, teaching at City College, on sort of a broader way of getting parents involved in schools.
So what amazes me is how many of the thematics that we talk about keep coming back up decades later. And so even you just talking about mental health and the intersection between mental health and education. I mean, that's so front and center in our discussions at all levels of education right now.
Right.
Yet you were involved in this 40 years ago. During the first set of presidential debates a couple of weeks ago, there was a discussion about busing and integration. And 20 years before you were on the school board, you were chosen to chair the community task force on school integration.
Yeah.
How did that happen? What was that like?
So I was just real active with other, somehow we found people who were concerned about the direction of Long Beach. And because my kids were in schools, and it was very obvious that there were some schools that had a great majority of students of color, and other schools that didn't. I mean, it was such an enormous problem. It was an enormous problem in the country. It was a problem in California. And so I was connected with all the people that wanted to see change. And they then said, would you be the chair of this because you're outspoken and you can speak on our behalf? So it was a group consisting of a lot of community leaders and NAACP and LULAC and so on.
But Long
And
Beach,
because of that, excuse me, I was asked to sit on a board that was developed by the superintendent of Long Beach Unified and Nene Horn, the wife of the president of Cal State Long Beach.
Steve Horn.
They were the co-chairs of the State Guidelines Study Committee, which was, I want to say it was 50 members of school district and community people who wanted to come up with a solution to desegregate the schools in Long Beach. Because of that position as chair of the community task force, I was invited to sit on that.
So, but I mean, this was a hot topic of the day
yeah.
nationally.
It was.
And Long Beach avoided forced integration because of the work of this. I mean,
That's right.
How did you get people, because clearly this wasn't an easy topic then as it's not now.
Right.
How did you get
Yeah,
people
it's true.
to find common ground? And how did you navigate that, especially at a time where the demographics of the city were changing so fast?
You know, there were some people on this State Guidelines Study Committee that were very politically wise. And since we had to vote on the solutions, the tactic, if I could say that, was to come out with some extreme positions that we knew wouldn't be accepted, so that the more moderate position would be accepted. But if that was the starting place, that wouldn't have been accepted either. And following that, I was able to do a lot of work with the district to help develop magnet programs that really encouraged people to start moving to different parts of the city based on the education that the kids would get as opposed to who was in that school.
So somewhere along the line, maybe just before that, wanderlust took hold again, right?
Are you talking about when we lived in Mexico?
Yeah, I'm talking about when you lived in Mexico.
Yeah, so we went to live in Mexico. The boys were, let's see, in summer of 75, so they were 4 and 6 or 5 and 7, something like that. And it is kind of funny. People love to call us hippies. I mean, truly, people love to call us hippies.
You kind of were, weren't you?
But that's the thing. I don't know what that really means.
What was where did you live in Mexico?
So first of all, we drove to Mexico
In what?
in our VW bus.
And she wonders why they thought they were hippies.
Okay. All the books and clothes.
What were yours and Ellen's hair like at the time?
Yeah. Well, his was like this. Mine was like. But we drove through Mexico. It was just really fabulous. People were so wonderful. And the Spanish I had studied in school didn't really count. I mean, it's what you learn on the road and with people. And we lived in Puebla, and we also lived in Mérida, Yucatan, and drove the entire country, up and down and back and forth. And boys went to schools there, regular schools, and it was just a great year. I love Mexico. So beautiful. It was a wonderful time to be there. So.
And so when you came back to Long Beach, then what did you do?
So came back to Long Beach, and I
It's
think
about
that's
76, 77?
yeah, that's kind of when I went to work for the Centro de la Raza, East Long Beach Neighborhood Center, as the mental health consultant for Head Start, and I was bilingual. And yeah, it was really great. And I did some work with, we actually had some publications, had a publication in the Journal of Community Psychology on behavioral screening for preschool children to try to understand if there were differences based on ethnicity and language and so on. Did that with one of the professors at Cal State Long Beach. So those were really good years, and some other time the Historical Society will be studying the history of the Latino community in Long Beach, because it really connects with what happened to the Centro de la Raza and so on and so forth.
And I mean, we're talking about a quadrupling of the Latino population, probably from 65 to the mid-80s in the city?
Yes,
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
just really on the ground floor of shifting.
You know, my memory of those early 70s was that I was just struck with the warmth of Latinos, the family feeling. I felt like I was home. It felt like my family. I was comfortable. And I think that's why we became so close. In fact, those were the years for my colleagues who were here from the port that we became friendly with Mario and Gloria Cordero.
So now we've got a good 10 years in Long Beach.
Right.
You've been involved in mental health, you've been involved in education, you've been a grad student, you've started raising a family. When did you get involved in, is it Labachi?
Yeah, Labachi, Long Beach area citizens involved was, I guess you could call it a watchdog group, fortunately. And this was a group that wanted to improve the governance of Long Beach and be more inclusive. And at that time, Long Beach had elections citywide. So for school district as well as city council, most of the elected officials were white and lived in one part of town. And so Labachi was a group that helped to organize, and there are a couple people here who were involved in those days. So Labachi helped to develop the district elections plan. That's not easy. It had to go to the ballot and so on and so forth. But we did that. We did that for city council, and subsequently we did that for the Board of Education and City College.
So, I mean, I think really those kinds of moves, going to district-based elections, really have proven to be one of the huge shifts in voting rights patterns.
Right.
In California, to be certain, but also nationwide. Why don't we take this as a chance for us to take a 5-minute break?
Okay.
And then we'll come back, we'll do a little more interview, and then we'll move into some questions from the audience before we wrap up tonight. So let's take about a 5-minute break.